Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another Sex Matters webinar. I'm Helen Joyce, the Director of Advocacy for Sex Matters. Our topic this evening is what parents need to know about gender distress. Well, I've got two panellists with me. I've got Stella O'Malley, who's a psychotherapist in Ireland and an author, and I've got Matilda Gosling, who is a researcher, a social science researcher, who has written 3 papers that Sex Matters has published on the question of what gender-distressed children need and what we know about them. And so what we're going to do this evening is we're going to start with Matilda, who is going to do about a 15-minute presentation with slides in which she looks at what the evidence tells us. Obviously, she can't cover everything that she does in those 3 papers, so I do urge you to go to the Sex Matters website and download them. And then I'm going to bring in Stella, and I'm going to explain why Stella is somebody who can respond from a more clinical perspective, from a therapeutic perspective to the things that Matilda is talking about. And then I'll bring Matilda back in and we will have a 3-way conversation. So thanks very much to everybody who has pre-submitted questions. It's very useful in preparation, and we've woven a lot of those questions into our conversation as we've planned it already. But also you can keep adding questions in the chat function on Zoom, in the Q&A function on Zoom, and I will try to get to as many as I can, and they will help both Stella and Matilda in planning their future research, therapeutic activities, and future coverage from Sex Matters as well. All right, over to you, Matilda.
Great, thanks, Helen. Okay, I'm going to cover a few things this evening. The first will be a quick look at what the research says about social transition for gender questioning teenagers. The second will be a summary of advice for parents and carers on communicating with teenagers experiencing gender-related distress and how to support their mental and physical well-being. I might mention parents as shorthand while I'm talking, but please know that I'm including other carers too. The advice I'll cover is based on a series of interviews that I conducted with psychotherapists, parent support groups, and other experts. The key thing to highlight here is that these pieces of advice are only ideas. Parents and carers know their children best and will have the best sense of which ideas are likely to work for them and for their families. They're also not a fix for everything. Some situations are so difficult and complex that general advice can't touch the sides, and specialist support is likely to be needed. The ideas are based around the model of supportive waiting. In other words, we're not presupposing any particular long-term outcome, but instead supporting teenagers' well-being and general state of mind. This model is based on evidence showing that many concerns children and young people have about their gender will resolve, so it's not appropriate to affirm a new identity in a way that makes it more likely to persist. But as long as nothing is done to solidify or worsen distress, it's fine, of course, for teenagers to express themselves however they choose. Could I have the first slide, please? I want to start with social transition. I've put a couple of definitions on the slide, one from a study that I'll come back to in a moment, and one from Transgender Trend. The key elements of social transition are changes to names and pronouns. Clothing and hair are wrapped into the definition too, but seem less immediately relevant as they're part of how individuals choose to express themselves. And clearly, we're trying to move away from stereotypes in this area. I'm starting with what we know about social transition, as it's often the first contact point parents have with their children's concerns about gender identity. For example, a teenager who is Ava might want to become Adam and be known by he, him pronouns. If research and long-term outcomes haven't been considered, this can seem benign. We're used to validating our children for their personalities and their interests, and being asked to use different pronouns and a different name to match their preferred sense of who they are might seem like an obvious follow-on to this. It's probably easier to remain unquestioning in this area if you believe that identifying as a different gender is a permanent, unchanging state. We know this isn't the case. We know that teenage brains change rapidly and that they try on identities to see if they fit. The proof point is in the existence of people who desist from a trans identity or who detransition after medical treatment. Hearing their testimonies shows that mistakes can be made and that we need to be cautious in our approach. Could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. We also know that gender distressed children who have been socially transitioned are far more likely to remain in this distressed state. This slide shows the proportion of children who remain trans-identified as they grew up, from times when social transition tended to be limited on the left-hand side, compared on the right-hand side with a very recent study looking only at young people who'd been socially transitioned. It's clear how much higher these proportions are when social transition is at play. Could I have the next slide, please, which I'm hoping has a graph that was on the previous one? Thank you. You can see from one of the older studies here, which separated persistence and desistance by social transition status, that no children who had been fully socially transitioned ended up becoming comfortable with their sex, and that the vast majority of those whose distress resolved had not been socially transitioned. We don't know if this link is causal, but we do know that such a striking correlation suggests a need to tread very carefully. Possible reasons that social transition might cement gender-related distress include an increasing disconnect between how a teenager is being addressed and their changing body, a sense of shame or stigma attached to changing their minds so publicly, or concerns about being criticised by others, or more concrete thinking linked to reinforcement by trusted adults. We know that those who remain trans-identified are more likely to end up on a medical pathway, the effects of which can include a need for lifelong medical treatment, infertility, lack of sexual function, bone problems, and other irreversible physical effects, such as a deeper voice, more body hair, and male pattern baldness in biological girls. A recent study of parents of over 1,500 gender-questioning teenagers and young adults also found that once young people had socially transitioned, their mental health deteriorated. Social transition, then, while it may be seen as a harmless or even supportive act, needs careful evaluation by parents due to potential long-term harms. There's much more information in the paper, which will be linked at the end of the webinar. But briefly, changing pronouns is the area to be really careful about. Having a neutral nickname or similar, according to experts, is less likely to have the same potential to amplify distress than language that highlights a mismatch between how a child is addressed and the physicality of their bodies. Could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. I've listed some themes from the interviews I conducted that underpin much of the advice to parents and carers who have gender-questioning teenagers. The first theme is about minimising conflict. There's already so much potential for conflict with any teenager, particularly if parents have pushed back against pronoun use. It means being careful about locking horns. Perhaps it's healthy for teenagers to have a later curfew or the freedom to empty the snack cupboard without too much oversight. Moving away from conflict in less important areas gives parents a chance to forge a more relaxed relationship with their children and gives them room to hold the line in areas where it matters more, such as sitting down together for food or holding a line on social transition. The second is about finding ways to connect. Stella is brilliant on this. It might mean having movie nights together, shifting schedules to take them to a class or an event they love, or finding challenging ideas parents can talk about with their children that are light years away from gender. If a teenager is spending lots of time in their room, parents could bring them cups of tea, clean laundry or small treats, and go for short, gentle engagement each time they go in. The third theme is about expanding teenagers' horizons. Ideas about gender can be all-consuming, and obsessive thinking about anything isn't great for developing minds. This theme is about culture and ideas, as well as getting active and moving. It might mean music or an art club, or talking about politics, or getting out into nature together, or perhaps encouraging a new interest or skill. The fourth point is about keeping warm and engaged, which can be really hard to do if parents are feeling rejected by their children, but is so important, at the same time as having hard stops on certain things. For example, parents might limit time spent online for younger teenagers and be clear that they won't tolerate rudeness. Parents can minimise conflict relating to boundaries by leaving the room once they've stated their limit. Boundaries help to act as guardrails and help teenagers to feel safe and protected, even if they argue against them. As with the first point, though, it's wise to limit the limits to those that really matter for children's health and well-being, and for anyone else who lives with them. The final theme is about moving attention away from gender. If there are other children in the home, they have important needs, as do parents. It's also important for gender questioning teenagers to be able to spend time away from thinking about gender. Spending lots of time talking about identity with children can make thoughts of it take up even more room in their heads. Next slide, please. This slide and the ones that follow it include a quote from the interviews I conducted, plus a summary of the ideas in each section. Again, these are only ideas. Parents know their children and their relationship with each other and are going to have the best idea of which ideas are most likely to resonate. Due to time, I'm only going to touch on a few ideas from the paper, but hopefully some of the more important ones. This part is about the importance of noticing. Perhaps parents could ask themselves some questions. How are you and your child communicating with each other? Are there any flashpoints or patterns that keep replaying? And if so, how might these be avoided? Are you able to extract yourself cleanly from a conversation if there's conflict brewing that's unlikely to be helpful to either of you? What is your child not saying to you? What are the places or spaces where they find it easiest to speak? And how can you spend more time together in these? Next slide, please. This slide is about handling disagreement. The first thing to say here is that it's fine to disagree and parents don't need to hide this. The key is to prevent any disagreement turning into unhealthy conflict, which means perhaps handling it lightly. Parents can show that it's healthy to disagree on things, and it makes for a richer, more interesting world if we are able to do so. If teenagers can learn that disagreement is healthy and that the world doesn't fall apart when it happens, it will take some of the heat out of conversations about gender. There's room in lots of conversations to have a variety of views, and it may be particularly useful for those experiencing gender distress to learn the shades of grey in between black and white positions. In others, in conversations about boundaries and limits, parents might recognise and validate their children's disagreement, but they still need to draw a clear line. Next slide, please. The final few slides are about supporting teenagers' minds and bodies, and this first one looks at the background work. Some of this, for parents who aren't dealing with this issue, or at least who aren't dealing with it yet, may come before the teenage years. For example, educating children about what to expect during puberty. It's hard and it's messy and it can feel grotty, but we all go through it and get through it, and it's utterly normal. Validating gender non-conformity can be useful, being clear that parents accept their children for who they are, their personalities, their character traits and their interests, however these align with society's preconceptions about what makes a girl and what makes a boy. Parents might also want to practice acting rationally and casually if their teenagers say something that's likely to bring up some of their own issues. For example, if a parent has a history of disordered eating and their child makes a comment that brings this up, an emotional response is probably something it's wisest to avoid. And there are 3 things that are really likely to underpin teenagers' well-being: making sure things are set up so they find it easy to sleep, to access a variety of nourishing food, and to find opportunities to move their bodies. Next slide, please. I won't spend too much time on the online world, as the ideas on the slide speak for themselves. It's worth knowing that teenagers can get lost online and that there are lots of social media rabbit holes relating to gender distress where they can be made to feel worse and worse about themselves. One interviewee pointed out that it tends to be dose dependent. So 15 minutes on a site that makes them feel bad about themselves is very different than spending hours on it a day. Parents will have a good idea of what limits are likely to work for their children. A key is likely to be to set family-based rules for everyone's online well-being, so one's parents are prepared to follow too. For example, not having screens in bedrooms or keeping phones away from meal times. Next slide, please. Gender-related distress can sometimes link to teenagers feeling disconnected from their bodies, particularly if they've had a difficult puberty or they're struggling with, for girls, a newly discovered male gaze, for example. Matter-of-factness is the goal here. That means recognising and being honest that it's normal to feel uncomfortable in our bodies. It doesn't mean that anything is wrong. It means parents not going too far in their efforts to make teenagers feel comfortable in themselves. A barrage of compliments may make them believe there's something wrong with them, whereas the occasional light touch compliment is likely to be more reassuring. It means not jumping on a passing comment about their bodies, and it means parents showing how to feel comfort in their own skins, not criticising their looks or the looks of other people, and focusing on what bodies can do, not what they look like. Next slide, please. The final part of supporting mind and body is about expanding horizons. This links back to the point I mentioned earlier about getting teenagers out of their heads and opening up their worlds. Their minds may be attempting to close down to focus on one area, and the task for parents is to keep sufficient inputs and resources in place that they can develop other interests, find other challenges and curiosity about worlds beyond their own. This may feel impossible if they're spending all their time in their bedrooms, but some of the ideas from Stella I mentioned earlier about making small, warm approaches into their rooms is likely eventually to draw them out, however gradually. Final slide, please. I've put some resources on this slide, some that can help to open things out for teenagers and some that may be interesting for parents as background reading. If you don't have time to note these down, they're all mentioned in the final part of the teenager series, which Helen will be linking at the end of the webinar. So that's a whistle-stop tour of some of the ideas from the paper, but Stella and Helen will add more depth in the discussion that follows. So over to you two.
Thanks very much for that, Matilda. I'm going to bring Stella in and I'll explain why we're using Stella as a sort of respondent to that, as Matilda said, whistle-stop tour of the work that she has done for Sex Matters. And so Stella is not just a psychotherapist, she's one of the co-founders of GenSpect, which is an organisation for therapists and medical professionals who work in this field in a questioning, open-ended way, rather than just going down the gender affirmative route that is recommended by, for example, the American Association of Paediatrics or WPATH. Stella is also the author of 4 books about parenting and children. So they are Cotton Wool Kids, Bully-Proof Kids, Fragile, and this, the most recent one, What Your Teen is Trying to Tell You, which was released in March 2023. And some great quotes there from some admirable people about what a good book it is. And Stella is also one of the 2 co-hosts of the fantastic Gender A Wider Lens podcast. So in all sorts of ways, in her work with parents and her work with gender questioning children, and in the enormous amount of interaction that she has with other people in this field, she's a great person to give us really sort of clinical and therapeutic insights to the sorts of things that Matilda was giving us the research overview of. So I've used questions that have been put in, pre-submitted by people who booked the webinar, Stella. Let's start with, how should parents navigate desistance? So Matilda mentioned that some kids identify in some way as trans and then they stop, and this must be a tricky dance.
It's very, very tricky. Handling desistance is often almost more fraught than people who are parenting the child who's trans-identified, because it feels very scary. It feels like if it goes wrong, they're going to revert back into a trans-identification, and it feels like they could be very happy by desisting. And so the parents feel like they've already been on an emotional tightrope for maybe months, often years, and then they're thinking, oh my God, are we coming out of it? And it does feel very, very tense and exhausting, and the parents can just want to hurry it on, and I would urge them not to. I think it's very important that, in a way, very often with desistance, not always, but very often, there might be a sexual awakening happening. So it can feel very private. And so the last thing they want is somebody to comment on the pretty blouse or the t-shirt or the top. They don't want it because they're actually hoping that nobody will quite notice that they're desisting. Now that can seem ridiculous, but the world of desistance is filled with two things going on. They think that they can still remain trans-identified but pull away at the same time. So there's a lot of kids, for example, identify as non-binary, having identified as trans, as a way of desisting. And the parents bull in saying, does this mean you're not identified? Does this mean you're not going to medicalize? Does this mean, because frankly, the parents very understandably want to calm their own frazzled, anxious minds. But actually what the child probably very often wants is, can people just look away while I reorganize my identity? And can I emerge without comment, please? And very, very hard to do that. And it takes a lot of sensitivity, if at all possible, a lot less comment and a lot more expansive opportunities for the child to try out a new identity in a place where they don't know other people. So whether you go on holiday or you go other places to a new city for a weekend, so they can try out without comment their other identities, and you don't be the people to comment. Let the parents not, just zip it. I think it's much more helpful. Just find places where other people don't know them so that they can try out their identities freely. And it's really difficult to do this.
Yeah, so actually the person who asked this question said, I let her initiate all conversations about trans. Is this the right approach? And that sounds like she's being quite wise. Yeah. Another question that came in from somebody who registered, lots of parents wonder if they can row back after initially taking an affirmative approach. What are your thoughts? I guess what happens here is that, a child comes home and says, I'm trans. Parents are maybe blindsided, look it up, discover the terrible things that are said about how your child might kill themselves if you don't just affirm them. Or indeed, they just think, yeah, why not? And then belatedly, they maybe discover that it's not as straightforward as they thought. And now they don't know what to do. And they think that maybe they should initiate a detransition. Is there something that you would like to say to that?
Yeah, an awful lot of parents presume social transition, for example, is benign. So they roll with it thinking, kids, it's the latest fad, off they go. And then as the weeks roll into months, they realize this is actually a much trickier and darker phenomenon than we had realized. And now we want to row back. In my work, I get a lot of questions around rowing back. It's really difficult. It does take a bit of preparation, where you might stop emphasizing the child's pronouns or name. You might disentangle name from pronouns. Maybe you might row back on pronouns and let them keep their name, rather than seeing that as just the one decision. It can be two different decisions. You can say, I'm choosing, we've talked about it, we've tried it, we've worked as much as we could with your pronouns, and it's feeling like it's a barrier to our knowing you. It's feeling inauthentic. It's feeling like a barrier to intimacy between you, my most precious person in the world. And so we're not going to use the pronouns anymore, but we're going to let you keep your name. So if you want to use this new name, that's fine, but we're actually going to no longer try and put that square peg into the round hole, because we feel it's actually creating a wall between us. Now, that would be done with a bit of preparation. That would be a conversation that you don't just jump into. You think about it, you think about how you're going to say it, and when you say it, frankly, you say it well, you say it and you leave. You don't have to have them kind of agree that this is a brilliant idea. You could expect, for example, a lot of distress. You might give yourself 6 weeks to check it out and see whether there's going to be an improvement in the connection. Not 6 days, like 6 weeks. So give yourself a bit of time to see whether you rowing back in the pronouns have been a good idea. It's fraught, and there could be loads of fights, but in a way there's fights anyway. And the eggshells and the fakeness is so disheartening for the parents and the children that maybe it's better to be authentic and fight than inauthentic and fight. So it's worth doing, but a hell of a lot of preparation, and decide what you're going for. So maybe it'll be, I'm contacting the school about the pronouns, or maybe it'll be very specifically one thing, and then wait 6 weeks and then reconsider. Maybe in a few months you might go at something else rather than going all in. You could go all in, but it could be so difficult. It's like a crash diet. You might be better off just cutting the scone and, giving it a bit of time, and then go for something else. I think that's more doable. It's like a long-term you know what I mean, commitment rather than crashing in, because that can lead to a crashing failure.
So I was interested at GenSpect. I was very struck by the fact that a lot of the parents who are most distressed by their connection with their children is actually adult children. And of course, that's children who are making their own decisions. They may have left home, but they're certainly over 18, so it's in their own hands. And indeed, quite a few of the questions that came in, some quite distressing ones, were from parents of adult children. And I think they can be kind of summed up by, well, a lot of them can be summed up as, how do you think parents should deal with alienation or estrangement from a child who has decided to cut them off, presumably because they don't agree?
Yeah, it's a really sad aspect of this movement. We're quite young, you know, maybe we're all 5 or 6 years in, depending on, some people are 8 years in, but not many of us are very long in. And so a lot of the kids who were first teenagers are now young adults, and we're seeing the impact of what's going on. Estrangement and alienation is really, really difficult. Often there's kind of two schools of thought. Some people say keep the connection no matter what, and therefore allow your child to behave as they wish in your household, so as to keep the connection. Other people, and I kind of fall more on this side, is you have your values and you have your rules of your household. You don't allow your 19-year-old drink vodka at 9 in the morning, nor should you allow abusive behavior at 9 in the evening, if you follow me. So there is certain rules that you should perhaps keep. If your child has estranged from you, arguably the best way to kind of keep in contact is send kind of gentle, kind of funny little connecting texts or messages with no ask to reply. It might be a funny story about a puppy that they'd like because they love dogs. It might be just a beautiful sunset, or, you know, a memory that came up on Facebook or something, but maybe not something of a photo of them when they were a girl, if you follow me, that you'd have sensitivity to it. It would be more a joint, gentle, shared joy of anything, and no request to reply. That's the easiest way to keep some sort of finger on the relationship. Some parents are dealing with children who have pulled away, but in many ways, transidentification for a lot of children is the kind of drive to individuate. They want to separate. They want to get away. They want to be their own person. So sometimes many of us will remember that when we were in our late teens and 20s, we pulled away to come back. So there has to be some faith in your own parent-child relationship that maybe one day they might come back, with acknowledgement that there is an extraordinary thing going down here, and these kids go in very deeply. So it's incredibly difficult. And I would say, trust yourself. You're the world authority on your child. Nobody knows your child better than you. What your instinct is telling you is probably a lot better than my own. Just kind of consider some of the points I'm making, but actually steer your own boat on that one, because it's so difficult.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I found myself saying to one of the women I talked to for quite a long time at GenSpect was, I hope that you're getting some support, because it didn't sound like there was anything that she could do anymore for her child right now, but she was very alone. There was no one she could talk to who agreed with her at all about it.
Yeah, the loneliness of the parents who are there thinking this is the most devastating attack on our family, and nobody quite gets it, except, conferences or webinars that they might go to and meet other people. I urge parents, if you're on your own, find other parents, go on the GenSpect Discord, go on wherever, find other people. Even if you don't get on that well with them, have a coffee, go get on the train, meet for an hour. You'll feel better because somebody else gets it. There's something very, very powerful about meeting somebody else who's in the same boat and gets where you're coming from. There's something that happens when people meet.
And so another question, several of the questions were like, I mean, I think we'll bring this up again when we bring Matilda back in, but parents expressing their own values about this, in particular a parent who thinks that this is all destructive and that trans ideology or gender identity ideology is just a destructive, maybe misogynistic, maybe homophobic movement. But you've got a child in your own home who thinks that it's the bee's knees and actually they're trans. Like, how do you express your own values? How do you explain what you think without just degenerating into screaming rows and having them stomp off?
Be very careful because often you hear of stories of like parents waiving studies and children waiving studies, and they're hitting each other over the head with studies, and it's really very destructive. It's probably a hell of a lot more helpful if you go specifically for your child and say, I don't think this is making you happier. I'm watching you and your arc, and I actually personally, whatever about all the other arguments, for you specifically in front of me, I don't think this is actually going to work, and these are the reasons why. If you go into the political, you're just going to find they're very comfortable arguing this. They're in their element arguing the politics. Well, if you go for the personal, they're a lot less sure of themselves because often they are unhappier in their trans identification, or certainly feeling a lot more dissonance inside themselves. So I don't really, if you've got a kid who's really caught up in things, I would say, I don't know if I would really argue that it's a good idea to go in at all politically. I think if the child, imagine, was really, really religious, would you go in talking about how you don't believe in God and these are the reasons why? Or would you go in personally to them? It can feel like you have to because there's so many facts you have to tell them. But I don't know if it's wise. I don't think it really gets very far. I think it leads to a lot of conflict. And it's slightly to the side conflict when there's something bigger going on, which is your kid. So I think there's loads of us arguing the politics. Leave it to us.
That's a very good idea. And also, I don't believe that people change their mind because other people have changed their minds for them. I think people change their own minds.
Yeah.
So you have to give them space to do that. A question about autism spectrum disorder. Why do these kids seem to suffer from gender distress more?
It's fascinating when you think about what is the autistic kind of mindset. They love a framework with rules and rules of engagement. And you say this and I say that, and this is what you have to do. They are often called the kind of the speech police before there was any sort of gender. They were very into, oh no, this is the way these are the patterns of engagement that we follow. And so they are very much going to gravitate to a world where there's a framework, there's rules, there's consequences. And not only that, it's very black and white. And so the autistic mind often doesn't think in metaphors. Instead, they think in the very kind of literal, the black and white. So if you say, I'm he, him, therefore I am a boy, follows very well for the autistic mindset. So it's almost perfectly framed for an autistic mindset. Hyperfixation is another autistic trait. So being completely fixated and absorbed on this makes sense. The lack of social kind of relaxation, the kind of the loneliness and the anxiety of an autistic person, they really kind of, they feel they found their people. Because there's all sorts of rules and frameworks and there's a hyperfixation. We're all talking about something incredibly cerebral. There isn't very much emotional kind of give or take. Instead, there's rules and frameworks. It's made for the autistic mind. And I think that's really unfortunate because it will make them arguably much less likely to pull out of it because they're very happy in this.
And then the last question before I bring Matilda in for a three-way conversation for you is just explain to our viewers what ROGD stands for. And do you think there are differences between boys and girls who might be ROGD? Because it does tend to get talked about as an exclusively female phenomenon.
Yeah, Lisa Littman studied it. She called it it's called rapid onset gender dysphoria, ROGD. And the idea was that there was a new cohort, like this 4,000% rise in girls in the last decade. I think it's gone up to 5,000% in the last decade, seeking medical transition. They've never appeared in the medical literature before this. And Lisa Littman was the first person to study it. And she did a study of 256 parents to discuss what is this phenomenon. It's not a diagnosis, it's a description of a phenomenon of mostly girls, but now in vast numbers, boys have started to kind of follow suit. And after an extended period online, have come out with the trans identification, and they often have other diagnoses. And there's often an element of social contagion because knowing somebody who's come out as trans is a very high indicator that they're going to come out as trans. They're very specific kind of criteria in this cohort, and they were never the same. This just wasn't ever relevant in this world, in the world of people who are seeking medical transition. They never appeared before. And they're a very good explanation, or certainly description, of what's going on at the moment of these girls. And then the boys have arrived. So a few years ago, we talked about the girls. And then we started noticing the parents of boys really made their voices clear. And they were right to, that there was a certain type of boy. Now, very like the girls, they're both socially awkward. They're often lonely. There's often been a bit of trauma. There's very often other diagnoses such as autism, ADHD, OCD, eating disorders. Very commonly, some of these diagnoses, very often anxious, cerebral, quirky, often, quite creative and quirky. They live in their minds, quite disconnected from their bodies. And they're a type of person that, frankly, we all knew. We went to school with these kids. We know these kids. These are a type, if you follow me. And they're often gullible. They're often naive and vulnerable to big ideas that look exciting. And also, because they're often lonely, because they're clever, and they often are very attracted to a solution to the distress in the world. And so they would be very attracted to kind of identity politics. The problem is the power and things like that. There is a difference between the boys and the girls. The girls often are very, ironically, quite girlish because they like all the fripperies. They like all the kind of give me my name change and the clothes and the look of it. And they even like the deodorant of the boy. And they like, it's kind of girlish what they go for. While the boy, the more testosterone driven, straight to it boy is often in his room, not actually interested in the fripperies as much more saying, one day I'm going to get hormones and I'm going to come out like Cinderella out of this room. And I'm going to come out in a ball gown, transformed. No messing around with names and, denim jackets and deodorants. I'm going for the real thing. I'm going for hormones. Very hard to penetrate that boy because there's no talking. He's in his room and he's not interested really in talking about it. He's just waiting until he can get his hormones. So there is a difference, but they're very, very similar in many ways.
Okay, I think I'll bring Matilda back in at this point. I mean, there's just so much to unpack there. I'd absolutely love to have ages to talk about, how we could go. But I guess, you don't solve people's problems in 5 minutes in a therapy session, so we can't possibly do more than touch on things in this webinar. I think a question for both of you. We've talked very much as if we're discussing families where already gender is a massive issue. But of course, you could think of preloading younger children or a non-gender questioning teenagers with ideas that could help them to resist, or indeed give them ways to navigate a world in which other people are going to be identifying as trans, even if they aren't. Maybe, Matilda, I'll start with you. How early is too early, or how could you start talking to a young child about gender, or should you?
Yeah, I think you can start relatively early. I think if you're trying to encourage critical thinking, probably as early as you want to go is good to start with that particular area. And actually, critical thinking is probably going to be one of the most useful skills to develop for children and young people in order to be able to kind of interrogate ideas that maybe don't make sense if you line them up against perhaps facts that they know from elsewhere. I think there is a real need to talk about having respect for other people's viewpoints. I think we talked about this briefly in the last webinar as well, but children are going to end up in a situation where they are surrounded by other children who think differently, and potentially teachers who think very differently as well. And actually, they could be putting themselves in a very vulnerable position if they're going in saying, I take a view that there are two sexes and it's binary, and I don't believe in this concept of identity. So it's probably a question of helping them to navigate that in a way that shows that they can be open to other people's opinions and beliefs and actually recognize it as a belief set, but at the same time kind of know within themselves what they believe, and that perhaps having the conversations with them as well, that there are some situations in which sex matters and it's important, and having a conversation about things like healthcare or refuges, or certainly with the older children about situations in which there does need to be a recognition of the binary sex and why it's important.
And can I bring Stella in on that too? What would you add to that?
I agree with what Matilda said, and very much so. I think it's also nice to have gentle conversations, age appropriate, about different worldviews. That, people came up with communism, people came up with socialism, people came up with religion as a way of making sense of the world. And it's very interesting. And at the moment, there's a very strong kind of push that identity politics is a new way of understanding the world. And that you kind of talk about that and talk about, there are two theories around, for example, gender, where some people have a gender identity within them and they believe that it's somewhere in them, very like a soul. And some people think that they are born as their bodies and they'll die with their bodies, and there is no identity that kind of lives on or lives before them. And that would lead into kind of talking about religion and, what Islam thinks, what Catholicism thinks. And so that they're kind of aware that there's worldviews that are very interesting to talk about, rather than going zeroing in straight into gender, seeing it as lots of different worldviews that are out there. Hopefully, before they know that there's war over this particular one, and make sure, if you are going that direction, that you make sure that you tell your kids, like, honestly, communism caused havoc in different places. Like, these worldviews, when people hold on too tight, like religious wars, can really cause destruction. And our job is to be decent and civil and understand that, different views are very interesting and they can make for better societies, but not to hold on too tight.
Okay, so a follow-up question then. This is another one from an audience member. How can we encourage flexible thinking in teenagers? Because they are very prone to being very rigid young people. I'll start with you, Stella.
Okay. I do want to point out that one of the big issues is an awful lot of the kids who are caught up in this have other diagnoses like ADHD or ASD, autism, and actually are very prone to rigid thinking. That's one of the actual traits of their diagnosis. So what you're asking of them is something that doesn't come naturally. One thing you can do, though, is bring in the fact that they have self-awareness to know that they're prone to rigid thinking, and not to get them necessarily out of it, but to be aware rigid thinking can lead to great unhappiness. So wanting the blue bowl or wanting, your red jacket, and that's the only jacket. And we can live with it, but also to be aware this can be one of your real attacks on your happiness. So if you hold something too rigidly, be aware that that is a very definite destructive force in your well-being. Rather than asking them to be flexible, be aware that sometimes they have to pull back from that if they're going to be happy. So it's kind of like, are you going to be rigid or are you going to be happy? Needs to be a kind of a thought process, which they might resist to the death, but at least it's in there as a concept. This is about rigid thinking. This isn't about you being right or wrong. That's how I do it.
I think, Matilda, rather than following up on that one, because we've got so many great questions, I think this is one that's got you written all over it, which is, do parents need to be concerned about non-binary identities?
So this was a question that I looked at when I was doing the interviews for the final part of the paper. And I think the general consensus seems to be that if teenagers are happy and they've got lots of interests and they're kind of playing with perhaps different identities, then it's not something to be too concerned about, although obviously you need to keep an eye on whether there are likely to be other factors at play. If the teenagers have kind of gone dark and they're spending a lot of time online and they're spending a lot of time on their rooms and they're feeling, or they're seeming as though they've been more caught up by the ideas, then that's a point at which to get slightly more concerned about it, and perhaps to draw in some of the ideas that we've discussed through this evening, and perhaps some of the ideas in the paper series as well. Because I think that the risk is that you can kind of, some teenagers will go through a non-binary identity and either will want to medicalise on the basis of that. So there are a number of young people who are known as they, them pronouns, but will go on to have mastectomies, for example, if they're female, or they might move to an opposite sex identity later on. So I think it's a question of just observing, trying to work out whether it's kind of the identity play that teenagers go through, or whether it's something more serious.
And I'll bring Estella in on that too. And just as I do that, I think it's very important I think, as a parent, not to be so fixated on being right or wrong. Like, I mean, if I'm speaking now to two adults that I know, I would say, non-binary is just nonsense. Like, everybody is one sex or the other. But why would I need to be right about that if my child is well and it's not causing them any harm, and it's their life, not my life, and so on? Does that sound like, Stella? You're looking skeptical.
Yeah.
Excellent. You fixed me there.
No. Well, I'm thinking back of when I was a kid, and I remember I had a friend who my parents massively disapproved of, and I remember thinking to myself, they don't get why I need socially to be friends with this person, and I couldn't have articulated it, but I knew it on a conscious level. I need to be friends with this. Just socially, this was necessary. I think this happens a lot with non-binary identities. Like Matilda very, very eloquently expressed there, sometimes it's very dark and you need to go in because this is making them very unhappy. Sometimes it's socially savvy to identify as non-binary. It just suits the social context. You'll get a lot of grief. You'll avoid a lot of grief. You're just doing something that's socially acceptable for the time that's actually very fraught. So I wouldn't underestimate sometimes, as far as I can see, there's some teenagers who are definitely doing something because they're socially adept and they realize that's what's needed from the group. Now, this can, and also it's a way of, but don't forget, of a way of desisting, is to desist into non-binary. Horribly, sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's actually, it's starting a whole rabbit hole. So, it's like classic psychotherapy. Well, it's one hand and on the other. Sometimes it's really, really a very definitely something you have to worry about. So it's kind of, as Matilda said, it's the vibe of the kid who's doing it. Some of them are doing it quite happily and you think they're all right. Trust them. They seem all right. Somebody else has taken a distressed turn and might need a way out.
Okay. I'll bring both of you in on this one because quite a few of the questions, I'm going to put them all together under a general heading of the meaning and interpretation of gender nonconformity at the moment. Because I think anyone who's a bit older, and I mean, we ladies are in the prime of our life, but you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. We're sort of basically pro-gender nonconformity in that we think that anyone should be allowed to do anything. And we love people playing, in a joyous way with signs and signifiers and so on. But that might be naive now. So, for example, one person said, my 18-year-old son shaves off all his facial, chest, leg and pubic hair and wears nail polish. Is this a sign he's transgender? Somebody else says, my 18-year-old son is in a sexual relationship with a trans woman. Does that mean he's definitely gay? Just quite a few questions that, another says that her teenage daughter now says that she's agender and her younger daughter says that she might be a boy. All of these kids are expressing what I would have said was gender nonconformity, and I'd like them to do that without changing their sex label, so to speak. Can we just let them play and discover, or is this a warning sign in this environment where they're going to be told that gender nonconformity means something about who they are? Stella, why don't you start, and then I'll turn to Matilda.
Because I'm dying to jump in. If we lived in a world where the doctors were doing their job and the clinicians were doing their job, this is exactly what we should be doing. They've created this new world, this new way of seeing things. We don't really get it, nor should we. We're the parents, they're the young people. This has been happening for generations, and isn't it great? The problem is we've got an entire kind of group of mental health clinicians, of doctors, of surgeons, of endocrinologists that are allowing people to weaken their healthy bodies, to damage their bodies by medicalizing their identities. And so sadly, we need to intrude upon this and make sure that the kid isn't hoping to medicalize when they don't need to, when they could avoid it. So it's a really sad indictment of what's going on, that we can't allow these kids to do exactly what you just said, shaving off hair and nail varnish and all that. Wouldn't it be great if this was the new way of just being a teenager? That they're into their labels, that's their thing, we don't get it, they get it, whatever, this happened before. So that's one answer. But the second answer is, body phobia, hair phobia, pubic hair phobia is a huge thing. Breast binding is a huge amount of hatred for the breast, hatred for their hair. There's a lot of really destructive forces behind a lot of these. It's a lot of self-loathing. It's a lot of body loathing. And, 20 years ago, when we worried about that early sexualization of children, we wondered, how's it going to impact this hypersexualization of teens and the early sexualization of teens? How's it going to impact? And it seems that a lot of them are rejecting sex and instead embracing gender. And they're afraid of sex. They're creeped out by sex. They don't like it. They don't talk very joyfully about sex. And they talk very filled with loathing. They despise their bodies. So I think societally, we have really wrecked what should be lovely sexual awakenings for young people. Now, this might be because I see the worst of it, but it feels like we've really lost our way in kids learning to have a sexual awakening in their adolescence and their early adulthood.
Can I bring you in, Matilda, if you have anything to add, either on the research base or even just, what you discovered while you were reading?
Yeah, of course. So I think I'll just go back a step because I think the questions that you're asking about are actually about kind of outcomes, and I'm thinking about the inputs that come from parents perhaps at a slightly earlier stage, because that was more what I covered during the research for the paper. So things like making sure that there are plenty of gender non-conforming role models around. So you talked about generations, so maybe for parents' generations it might be kind of Bowie and Prince, and for following generations it will be people that I'm far too unknowledgeable to be able to name, but I know that Harry Styles was mentioned in one of the papers that I was reading, and I'm sure that there will be lots of kind of equivalent female gender non-conforming role models as well. Obviously that doesn't help with situations as they are now, but I think it's really important continually to challenge stereotypes, to make sure that young people know that actually whether you're male or female, however you present is fine, and try and get back to those messages that we were kind of brought up with and that we understood, that actually because you don't fall in line with those kind of stereotypical ideas about male or female doesn't mean that there's something wrong, that actually it just means that you have a personality.
A question about social contagion at the very sharp end. How much control do you suggest when you know or suspect that a lot of the gender distress is arising from a friendship group, mean girl cliques in a daughter's school who are obsessed with pronouns? Do you go in soft or do you be firm? And Matilda, I'll start with you if you have anything to add to this one, or would you prefer that I start with Stella?
No, I'll start. I'm sure Stella's got kind of more detail that she can add, but just from the information that I've covered, I think it's a really difficult one, because you've got obviously parents have limited influence over friendship groups, and actually arguably parents should have limited influence over friendship groups as well. Stella may have a different view, but I think really it's from the perspective of what I've read in the interviews that I've done, I think it'd be a question of actually kind of holding the line at home in terms of just making sure that all of those support structures that we discussed earlier are in place, that the parent-child relationship is strong, that critical thinking skills are developed, and that all happens aside from school, because I'm not sure that it's appropriate necessarily for parents to get involved in what's happening in their children's friendship groups, and it has the potential to go horribly wrong as well. I know that a couple of the experts that I spoke to said that if it's really difficult, so children are incredibly distressed, they're talking about medical transition, and there doesn't seem to be a way to get them out, that maybe drastic solutions such as kind of moving school, moving house could be considered, but obviously that's a very, very kind of end of the line solution.
And Stella, can I bring you in on that one?
Yeah, I agree with Matilda that, trying to control friendship groups is very perilous in adolescence and not really recommended. There is, however, a character that very often crops up in this world, which is the female cheerleader. And this kid is often very charismatic and really, really encourages the trans identification of a naive kind of awkward kid who, for the first time ever, is part of the cool group because of their trans identity. And so that's a very unfortunate scenario. So making sure that the kid slowly but surely gets to know how much influence that female. It's often female, I shouldn't say, but it is very often. And sometimes, by the way, the concept is female cheerleader, kind of socially awkward boy who's never had any female attention. And suddenly there's this group of girls just kind of dressing him up like a doll, and he's just in his element. And it can be really difficult to watch. I do think more than anything, often your child has got fixated on something, and the parent's job is to expand their world in any way. I think interesting holidays, weekends away, anything that will just bring them out of their one-track mind into something a little bit more, just left turns, right turns that they wouldn't expect. People often think it's all about therapy, and I really don't think so. I think you're trying to expand their mind in lots of different ways.
I think we've got time for one more question, and it's a difficult one, so I'm sorry to have to ask for relatively short answers, but I think it's one that comes up a lot. Any advice for a blended family where one household affirms and the other does not? We worry that in the end she will end up staying with only the other house. Stella, do you want to take that one first?
Yeah, this is really, really difficult. I do think it can be probably the hardest road when one parent on the other house, because they do very often go towards the affirming. I do think if you can at all just kind of come out authentically to your child about your views, that you think genuinely you love them more than life itself, they're so precious to you. It's the medicalization and the weakening of their body that you're worried about, and that if you can say it and leave it at that you get it once said and said well, and kind of prepare for that. You know what I mean? Kind of use your words, think about it before you say it. Don't just blurt it out. Have it really prepared, like how much you love them, how worried you are, that it comes from a place of fear and love. And there's no lack of love in this position, and you acknowledge that the other parent is taking a different road. And honestly, love will come through one way or the other, and leave it at that, if you follow me, rather than kind of arguing every single point. Just come out to the child, because if you're trying to death by a thousand cuts, no, I don't want this, no, I don't want that, and you never actually come out to the child, it can cause way more trouble, way more destruction than actually just saying your piece once and leaving it at that. But it's really, really, really hard.
Matilda, is this one that you want to come in on, or is there another point that you would like to make before we wrap up for the evening?
I think Stella's put that absolutely beautifully, and I've got nothing to add on that question. I don't know if there's anything, is it worth talking very briefly about schools and engaging with schools?
So quite a few questions did come up about schools, and we have a lot of materials on the Sex Matters website that I want to direct people to. And I do think that parents are almost, overwhelmed by schools pushing this on them. But yes, a few pointers from you on this, Matilda, would be a great way for us to close out the evening.
Yeah, I mean, I think just very briefly, it's worth kind of trying to, in any engagement with schools, trying to be constructive, clear, and obviously non-combative as well. And also bearing in mind, if you are the parent of a gender questioning child, that there is going to be a risk that conversations might be shared potentially with the child as well. So just keeping that caution in mind. I think one thing that's likely to be really helpful, hopefully, is that the government has forthcoming guidance for schools, which should be published in the next week or two. And actually, if that takes a more critical approach in schools in England, as is expected, then actually it gives parents something to take with them to the schools, saying, okay, this is the government guidance. What are your policies now, and how are you going to be approaching it? And it kind of gives a useful toolkit, hopefully, if it says what we hope it's going to say going forward.
Well, I'll just bring back Stella, and I wanted to say thank you to both of my panellists. And just before I wrap up the webinar, I'll say that, the questions that came in were often heart-rending. All of us are very well aware when we talk on this subject that there are people who are really very unhappy and very sad stories. So people asking, will I ever feel better about being estranged from my child? Will I ever be able to reconcile myself to this? That sort of question. So thank you both for the work that you do very much. I'm going to say goodbye and good night to both of you now, and just say a couple of words about what Sex Matters does before I wrap up the webinar. Thanks, Stella. Thanks, Matilda.
Thank you.
So what Sex Matters does is it's a human rights organisation that campaigns for a very simple thing, which is clarity on sex in law, policy and everyday life. We're based in the UK. You can support us by paying a small amount every month and get our weekly memo and a bit of merch and see us at events that we do around the country.